February 9th, 2015. The British Treasury does something extraordinary. They write a check. Not for millions, not for billions, for debts that predate the light bulb, for wars fought before America existed, for bonds issued when Napoleon was still alive. 4 billion pounds sterling. Gone. In a single transaction. This isn't a bailout. This isn't a crisis. This is Britain finally closing the ledger on debts, stretching back 2.5 centuries. The longest IOU in financial history. Paid in full. But here's what nobody tells you. This wasn't about money. This was about something far more dangerous. Something that had been quietly accumulating in Britain's balance sheet since 1720. A financial time bomb that took 9 generations to defuse. And the story of how it got there reveals the dark machinery of empire, war, and the most elegant financial weapon ever created. Welcome to the world of perpetual debt. London, 1751. Britain has a problem. They've been fighting wars for 50 years straight. The War of Spanish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession, endless colonial conflicts, each one funded by government bonds. Promises to pay back investors with interest. But here's the issue. Those bonds have maturity dates. And when they come due, the government has to pay. All at once. Billions in today's money. Britain doesn't have it. So they do something revolutionary. They hire a financial architect named Henry Pelham. And he creates a new type of bond. One that changes everything. Consolidated annuities. Consols. The trick? No maturity date. Ever. You lend the government money. They pay you interest forever. But they never have to give your principal back unless they choose to. You can sell the bond to someone else. But the debt itself? Immortal. It's brilliant. It's dangerous. It's permanent. And it works. Within months, Britain consolidates all its chaotic war debts into these perpetual bonds. 3% interest, paid annually, into infinity. Investors love it. Steady income. Forever. The British Empire just invented a money printer that never stops. But they also invented something else. A debt that never dies. Here's what happens next. Britain fights everyone. The 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars. Each conflict costs more than the last. Each one funded by more consols, more perpetual debt. By 1815, after finally defeating Napoleon at Waterloo, Britain's national debt peaks at 260% of GDP. In modern terms, that's roughly 7 trillion pounds, most of it in consols. But the economy is booming. The Industrial Revolution is printing money. Britain controls a quarter of global trade, so paying 3% interest forever seems manageable, until it isn't. Because here's the dark secret about perpetual bonds. Compound interest is a silent killer. Pay 3% forever, and you're not really paying debt, you're paying rent on debt. The principal never shrinks. Every year, billions flow from taxpayers to bondholders, forever. By 1900, Britain is still paying interest on debts from 1720. 80 years before the American Revolution started, Britain issued bonds to bail out the South Sea Company after its bubble collapsed. Those bonds? Still paying interest in 1914, when the lights went out across Europe. Britain was still servicing debts from the age of sailing ships. And then the Great War began, August 1914. World War I doesn't just kill 17 million people. It obliterates centuries of economic orthodoxy. Wars used to be fought with existing gold reserves and taxation. Not anymore. This war is industrial, mechanized, infinite appetite for shells, bullets, aircraft, warships. Britain needs money, immediately, more than exists in the economy. So they issue the largest bond drive in history. War loans, 3.5% interest, officially redeemable, but in practice, perpetual. Because Britain will never have enough cash to pay them back. The pitch is pure propaganda. Lend to your country. Defend civilization. Earn steady income. And people believe it. By 1917, Britain has raised 2 billion pounds from citizens. Everyone buys in. Factory workers, aristocrats, school children donating pocket money. Even King George V buys bonds. It's patriotic. It's necessary. It's a trap. Because when the war ends in 1918, Britain's debt has exploded to 140% of GDP. And most of it is in bonds that will pay interest forever. The same bonds that, 97 years later, will still be on the Treasury's books. But in 1918, nobody's thinking about 2015. They're thinking about survival. The empire is bankrupt, the pound is collapsing, Germany owes reparations it will never pay, America is demanding repayment of war loans Britain can't afford. And the interest payments keep coming every year, like clockwork. 3.5% of £2 billion, £70 million annually, forever. The machinery of war has been replaced by the machinery of perpetual debt. What happens when you owe money forever? You bleed slowly. Between 1920 and 1945, Britain never stops paying interest on consols and war loans. Through the Great Depression, through mass unemployment, through World War II when London is burning and the empire is fighting for its life. Every year, billions flow to bondholders. Many of those bondholders are dead. Their descendants inherit the bonds. The income passes through generations like a title. Victorian-era debts paying Edwardian heirs funding Georgian trust funds. The debt becomes hereditary. Meanwhile, Britain's economy is struggling. The empire is disintegrating. India gains independence. Colonies break free. The industrial lead evaporates as Germany and America surge ahead, but the bonds keep paying. By 1950, Britain is still servicing debts from the South Sea bubble, still paying interest on the Napoleonic Wars, still honoring the 1917 war loan, 230 years of accumulated debt. All alive, all demanding payment. And then something shifts. Interest rates start falling. For decades, rates hovered between 3 and 6%. But in the 1980 and 90, they begin a long, slow decline. By 2015, UK government borrowing costs hit historic lows. Below 2%, below 1%, suddenly paying 3.5% interest forever makes no sense. The Treasury does the math. They can borrow new money at 1%, pay off the old consols and war loans, and save billions in perpetual interest. After 9 generations, it finally makes financial sense to kill the immortal debt. December 2014. Chancellor George Osborne stands before Parliament and makes an announcement that echoes across centuries. Britain will redeem the 1917 war loan, £4 billion, plus an additional 800 million in consols, dating back to the 1720, the oldest debts in continuous government obligation, finally cleared. The bonds issued to fund the slave trade abolition. Paid off. The bonds issued to bail out the South Sea Company. Paid off. The bonds issued to fight Napoleon. Paid off. The bonds issued to fight Kaiser Wilhelm. Paid off. On February 9th, 2015, the transfers execute. The bondholders get their principal back. After generations, the contracts are complete. The British Treasury saves £200 million annually in interest payments. But here's what's haunting. Some of those final bondholders are descendants of the original purchasers. Great-great-great-grandchildren collecting on investments made in the 1700s. Families that have been receiving government checks for longer than the United States has existed. The debt didn't just span centuries. It spanned bloodlines. So what does this tell us? First, debt doesn't forget. It doesn't care about revolutions, world wars, or the collapse of empires. It just compounds, quietly, eternally. Second, perpetual financial instruments are incredibly dangerous. They seem efficient during crisis. Borrow now, pay interest forever, deal with it later. But later can become centuries, and the interest bleeds you dry. Third, Britain's 2015 redemption wasn't altruism. It was ruthless financial optimization. They only paid off these ancient debts when interest rates fell so low that keeping them became economically insane. For 265 years, it was cheaper to pay interest than principal. Think about that. 9 generations of British taxpayers funded debts. Their ancestors incurred fighting wars they'd only read about in history books. And here's the terrifying part. This isn't ancient history. Right now, governments worldwide hold perpetual bonds. Debts with no maturity. Japan has them, Switzerland has them. Even the European Central Bank has discussed issuing them to fund pandemic recovery. The 1917 war loan might be paid off. But the machinery that created it is still running, because when governments need money desperately, they make promises their grandchildren will have to keep. Let's zoom out. Between 1720 and 2015, Britain paid interest on these perpetual bonds every single year for 295 years. Conservative estimate, £75 billion in cumulative interest payments. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $400 billion in today's money. All to service debts that, had they been normal bonds with 30-year maturities, would have been paid off by 1947. But they weren't normal bonds. They were immortal, and immortality is expensive. Here's the paradox. Perpetual bonds saved Britain during crisis. Without them, the empire might have collapsed in the 1750, unable to fund wars. Without the 1917 war loan, Britain might have lost World War I. But that salvation came with a price tag that stretched across 3 centuries. Every school built after 1918 competed for funding with war loan interest payments. Every hospital, every pension, every infrastructure project had to share the budget with debts from the Napoleonic Wars. The past was eating the future. For 9 generations, and Britain isn't unique. France had perpetual bonds until the 1980. The Netherlands still has some active from the 1600. Austria has bonds from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, still technically valid. The ghosts of old empires still haunt balance sheets because debt doesn't die. It just transfers. February 10th, 2015, the day after the redemption, something extraordinary happens. Nothing. The markets barely react. No headlines, no panic, no celebration. The oldest debt and continuous government obligation vanishes from the ledger, and the world shrugs. Because here's the truth. By 2015, these bonds were irrelevant. £4 billion in a £2 trillion economy. Background noise. But their irrelevance is exactly why they matter. For 265 years, Britain paid. Through revolutions, world wars, depressions, and the death of the empire itself, the government changed. The economy transformed. The country evolved. But the debt remained constant, patient, eternal, until interest rates fell low enough to make killing it economical. That's the final lesson. Perpetual debt can only be destroyed when something cheaper replaces it. Until then, it lives forever, feeding, compounding, waiting. The 1917 war loan is gone, but the logic that created it, still here. Governments still issue long-term bonds to fund crises, still promise future generations will handle the bill, still gamble that growth will outpace interest. Sometimes it works. Sometimes you pay for 265 years. And sometimes, on a quiet Monday in February, you finally close the ledger on wars fought before your great-great-great-great-grandparents were born. Britain's century-old war bonds are dead, but the machine that created them is immortal. The last payment on the 1917 war loan was made 97 years, 11 months, and 30 days after it was issued. The bondholders who bought it to fund World War I were all dead. But the debt lived on until it didn't.